The night was cold and unwelcoming, the sort of night where the darkness feels thick, pressing against the windows of the soul, and even the streetlights struggle to keep their grip on the surrounding shadows. The city was winding down, and most people had retreated to the safety of their homes, but not everyone was so fortunate. It was 11:48 p.m., and Riley stood at the bus stop, a heavy backpack weighing down his shoulders and a chill seeping through his thin jacket. The bus stop was one of those older shelters, a structure of cracked glass and faded advertisements, splashed with graffiti and decay. The old wooden bench beneath the overhang groaned if anyone dared to sit on it for too long. Riley glanced at his phone. No new updates. The bus, scheduled to arrive 15 minutes ago, still hadn't shown up. He exhaled sharply, breath fogging the air, and shoved his hands into his pockets. The street was unsettlingly quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the whisper of the wind as it twisted around the darkened corners of closed storefronts. He noticed a figure standing further down the street. A man, motionless, wrapped in a long, dark coat. His head was tilted slightly, and Riley couldn't make out his features beneath the hood. The man was far enough away not to feel too threatening, but he hadn't moved an inch in the last several minutes, and that was disconcerting. Riley tried to shake off the unease. Probably just waiting for a ride, Riley muttered to himself, trying to focus on anything else. But his attention kept drifting back to that still, shadowed figure. Finally, he decided to turn around and face the empty road, watching for the bus. The minutes ticked by, his anxiety growing heavier. Then came a strange noise. Riley's ears perked up, and he turned slightly. It was a distant, wet sound, like the dragging of a soggy cloth along asphalt. Heart-pounding, he shot a glance back down the street. The figure had moved. It was now just on the other side of the street, still and silent, closer but just as obscured in shadow. A shiver raced up Riley's spine. "Okay, that's weird," he whispered, clenching his phone. He glanced at it, debating calling anyone to talk to. But the battery was low, the screen flashing 5%. He considered crossing the street to find somewhere safer, perhaps a nearby convenience store, but he remembered they were all closed. And the bus stop, broken down as it was, still felt like a somewhat secure island in the open street. The dragging noise started again, louder now, clearer. He could almost make out footsteps mixed with the dragging, like something or someone was limping, dragging something heavy behind. Riley whipped around, this time ready to confront whatever was coming. But the street was empty. The shadows shifted, but no one was there. "Get a grip," Riley told himself, swallowing his fear. He pulled his backpack closer, feeling the comforting bulk of his textbooks. As he turned back to face the road, he nearly dropped everything he was holding. The man in the dark coat was now on the sidewalk, directly in front of the bus stop. Riley staggered backward, almost tripping over the bench. The figure's head was still tilted, and its face was still hidden. But the closer it was, the more wrong everything seemed. The coat, it turned out, wasn't a coat at all. It was some ragged, flesh-like material draped over an impossibly thin frame. Riley could now see how the fabric pulsed and rippled like something breathing. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head the other way, making an unsettling crunching sound. The darkness around them grew colder, and the air tasted of iron, like blood in the mouth after biting the inside of a cheek. Finally, Riley forced himself to speak. "What do you want?" His voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper. The thing didn't answer. Instead, the dragging noise resumed, coming from behind Riley this time. He spun around, realizing too late that there wasn't just one of them. Emerging from the blackness was a second figure, even taller, its limbs long and distorted. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth, featureless skin, like a mannequin's. Panic surged through Riley, his fight-or-flight instincts kicking in. He backed up until he hit the glass wall of the bus stop. The first figure had stepped closer, and now Riley could see something even more horrifying. Beneath the pulsing fabric, eyes blinked open and shut, human eyes moving erratically, too many of them to count. With a strangled yell, Riley bolted, his feet pounding on the pavement. He sprinted down the street, not daring to look back, his breaths coming in ragged, terrified gasps. The dragging, limping sounds followed him, seeming to echo in every direction. Ahead, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, and Riley's heart lifted with hope. The bus. He waved his arms frantically, yelling, and the bus slowed, pulling up beside him. The doors creaked open and Riley stumbled inside, nearly collapsing with relief. He turned to the bus driver, an older man who watched him with tired but concerned eyes. "You okay, kid?" the driver asked, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Riley looked back out the windows, but the street was empty again, silent and still. The figures were gone, erased as if they had never been there at all. He took a shaky breath, nodding. "Yeah," he lied, sinking into the nearest seat. The bus lurched forward, and Riley tried to calm his racing heart, to convince himself he had imagined everything. But as the bus pulled away from the stop, Riley caught one last glimpse in the mirror above the driver's head. A figure stood in the middle of the road, watching the bus with too many eyes, its head still tilted. As they drove into the night, Riley knew he would never feel safe waiting at a bus stop again. The rain fell relentlessly, sheets of water cascading from a black sky, transforming the deserted streets into rivers of glistening pavement. The city seemed abandoned, the life drained out of it by the storm. Lara huddled under the narrow overhang of the bus stop, pulling her drenched hoodie tighter around her body, shivering from the cold. Her bus had been delayed, of course it had to be tonight, and she cursed herself for not calling a cab. The wind howled, making the broken glass panels of the bus shelter rattle like the teeth of something ancient. Lara's phone vibrated weakly in her pocket, but when she checked it, the battery symbol flashed red, and then the screen went black. She muttered a curse under her breath and pocketed the dead phone. Alone, cold, and without a way to call for help, she was starting to feel more than just frustration. Something about this place was making her uneasy. The streets were eerily empty, but she knew better than to mistake solitude for safety. Just then, Lara's eyes drifted to the poster plastered on the opposite wall of the shelter, partially peeled and faded. It advertised a circus that had long since come and gone, the grinning clown's face weathered and split. But what made her heart skip a beat was the whisper. It was faint, like the rustle of dead leaves on the wind, but undeniably real. A breathy, rasping whisper that seemed to dance just out of her line of sight. Lara whipped her head around, searching for the source, but the bus stop and surrounding street were as empty as before. Her pulse quickened, and she tried to laugh at herself. "Just the wind," she murmured. "Just the wind in the old shelter." But the whisper came again, clearer now and closer. "Lara." Her stomach clenched painfully. Someone had spoken her name. She wasn't imagining it. The sound was all too deliberate, too intentional. Lara's hands tightened into fists, and she swallowed hard. "Hello?" she called, hating the way her voice trembled. The rain pattered on, uncaring. Then she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Across the street, barely illuminated by a flickering street lamp, stood a man. He was tall and thin, and he wore an old-fashioned top hat, the kind that belonged in another century. The hat tilted slightly, hiding part of his face, and his body was wrapped in a tattered long coat. His head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and he did not move. Lara felt a scream building in her throat, but she forced herself to keep her fear under control. It was just some guy, some weirdo trying to get out of the rain. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The man didn't blink. He didn't shift or shiver in the cold. He just watched. "Hey!" Lara yelled, trying to sound braver than she felt. The figure did not react, but the whisper came again. "Lara?" It felt like ice sliding down her spine. She hadn't seen his lips move, but she knew the whisper was his. The shadows around him seemed to thicken, almost pulsing with each breath she took. She stumbled backward, her foot splashing into a puddle, and for one horrifying moment, she lost sight of the stranger. When she looked up again, he was gone. Panic flooded her senses. She spun around, heart hammering, but the street was empty, only the rain playing its relentless symphony. The bus stop felt suddenly suffocating, the narrow shelter pressing down on her, trapping her. She backed up, preparing to make a run for it, when the whisper returned. This time, it was directly behind her. "Lara." She froze, muscles locking with primal terror. She could feel a presence, something heavy, standing right at her back. The air grew colder, as if a void had opened, sucking the warmth and life from the space around her. She knew she had to turn around, but her body rebelled, unwilling to confront whatever nightmare had found her. Finally, summoning every shred of courage she had, she spun around. The bus stop was empty. Nothing but rain and shadows. Her breath came in short, Panicked gasps, and she backed up until she hit the cracked glass panel. A desperate, hysterical laugh almost escaped her lips, but then she heard it. A scraping sound, like fingernails against metal, echoing from beneath the bench. Lara dropped her gaze, horrified. A pair of hands was slowly reaching out from underneath, long fingers clawing their way into the dim light. The skin on those hands was pale and waxy, as if it had been soaked for too long, and the nails were jagged, caked with dirt. The hands kept coming, pulling with grotesque determination. Lara stumbled back, slipping on the wet pavement, and she watched in horror as a face emerged, half-rotted and eyeless, with a grin far too wide. "Found you," it croaked, voice a wet gurgle. Lara screamed, scrambling to her feet. She ran, not caring that she couldn't see through the rain, not caring if she fell or where she ended up. She only wanted to get as far away from that thing as possible. The whisper echoed in her ears, a haunting melody of her name, following her, even as she fled. When she finally reached a crowded main road, gasping and drenched, she looked over her shoulder one last time. The bus stop was far behind her, swallowed by the storm, but she knew she'd never forget that voice, and she knew that, one day, that thing might come back for her, no matter how far she ran. The last train of the night pulled away, its rumble fading into the distance, leaving the platform eerily silent. Alex stood alone at the rural train station, a forgotten little stop in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to go on forever. The cold wind howled through the trees, whispering secrets Alex didn't want to hear. It was almost midnight, and the station was nothing more than a cracked concrete platform with a single flickering light bulb hanging overhead. The small shelter offered no warmth or comfort, just a rickety bench and shattered windows that allowed the wind to creep through with ghostly fingers. Alex checked his watch, growing impatient. The bus that was supposed to take him the rest of the way home was late, and the isolation was getting under his skin. He wrapped his jacket tighter and paced, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched. The woods pressed in from all sides, thick and impenetrable. As he moved back and forth, he couldn't shake the sense that he was being observed, that something was lurking just out of sight, hidden in the blackness. A sudden rustling came from the trees. Alex stopped mid-step, his heart pounding. The noise was unmistakable, something heavy moving through the underbrush. He squinted, trying to see beyond the light's reach, but the woods were a wall of shadow. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. No response. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, though he didn't quite believe it. He backed up to the bench and sat, trying to convince himself he was safe. But then he heard it again, closer this time. Heavy footsteps, followed by a low, guttural growl, the kind of sound that belongs to a predator sizing up its prey. Alex sprang to his feet, eyes wide. He scanned the darkness, his pulse roaring in his ears. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence reigned once more, a silence so thick it felt like a living thing. And then, slowly, something emerged from the woods. A figure stepped into the dim light, and Alex felt his knees buckle. It was a man, at least that was what it seemed to be. But something was terribly wrong. The man's limbs were twisted, bent at unnatural angles, and his eyes were wide and unblinking, pupils too large, swallowing what little light there was. His mouth was stuck in a grotesque grin, stretched so wide it looked as though his lips had been slashed open. The man stood motionless for a moment, then took a jerky step forward. His bones cracked with each movement, as if his body wasn't used to walking. Alex stumbled back, hitting the glass of the shelter, too terrified to run. "Need a ride?" The man wheezed, voice broken and echoing like a malfunctioning speaker. His head twisted to the side with a sickening pop, and he tilted it, waiting for Alex's answer. Alex couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Every muscle in his body was frozen in place. The man's grin widened, if that was even possible, and his eyes rolled wildly in their sockets. He took another step, his limbs creaking. Alex finally broke free of his paralysis, adrenaline flooding his veins, and he bolted toward the edge of the platform. He ran with no destination in mind, only away from that horrifying, twisted thing. But the footsteps followed, uneven and heavy. Alex didn't dare look back. He could hear the thing crashing after him, feel its twisted presence closing in. The forest loomed ahead, and Alex knew he had no choice but to keep running into the woods. Branches whipped at his face, and the ground was uneven, but he forced himself forward. Behind him, the thing followed, its voice echoing in the dark. "Don't you need a ride?" it called, giggling in a way that was utterly inhuman. Alex tripped over a root, sprawling into the dirt. Pain exploded in his knee, and he scrambled to get up, but it was too late. The footsteps were right behind him. He turned, sobbing with terror, and found himself staring up at that grin. The man loomed over him, eyes bulging, head twisting at an impossible angle. But then the thing paused. Its head jerked up, and its grin faltered. A new sound cut through the air, a rumbling, the roar of an engine. The headlights of the long-overdue bus appeared in the distance, cutting through the night. The twisted man hissed, his grin dissolving into a snarl. He backed away, his limbs cracking and folding back in on themselves as he melted into the shadows. Alex lay there, shaking, as the bus pulled up, its doors opening with a soft hiss. A worried-looking bus driver leaned out. "Hey, you okay, kid? Need a ride?" Alex stumbled to his feet, tears streaming down his face, and all he could do was nod. He climbed aboard, collapsing into a seat, his whole body trembling. As the bus pulled away, he looked back at the woods. The shadows had returned to silence, but Alex knew he'd never be free of the memory of that grin. A thick fog had rolled in over the city, shrouding everything in a gray-white mist that muffled all sound. Nina could barely see a few feet in front of her as she made her way to the bus stop, her breath fogging up the air and mingling with the damp, heavy mist. She cursed herself for staying late at the office, but her project had to get done, and now she was paying the price. The streets were deserted, and the fog made it feel like she was trapped in some dream-like limbo. The bus stop stood at the edge of an old park, its lone streetlight barely managing to cut through the fog. The swings and playground equipment looked ghostly, half visible in the haze, and the silence was thick and unnatural. Nina checked her phone. The bus was running late. Again. She tried to focus on the soft glow of her phone, resisting the urge to look over her shoulder into the swirling mist. But then she heard something. A soft, metallic creaking. It was a sound she knew well, the noise of rusted swing chains moving in the breeze. Except there was no wind. Nina's hands tightened around her phone, her pulse speeding up. She forced herself to turn and look. Through the fog, she could just barely make out the playground. One of the swings was moving, gently swaying back and forth. But there was no one there, nothing visible pushing it. It just swung back and forth, creaking in that familiar, haunted way. Nina's mouth went dry. She tore her gaze away, telling herself she was imagining things. The fog was playing tricks on her. But then there was another sound. A soft laugh, high and childlike, drifting through the mist. It was faint, but it carried through the silence like a whisper in her ear. She shivered, her fingers growing cold. "It's just the fog," she muttered. "Just some weird echo." But deep down, she didn't believe that. The laughter echoed again, this time from a different direction, as if whatever was laughing had moved, circling around her. Nina backed up until she felt the cold, uncomfortable solidity of the bus shelter's glass against her back. Suddenly, she felt it, the sensation of being watched. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She tried to focus on the street, desperately hoping for the headlights of her bus to break through the fog. But the road was empty. The laughter came again, closer this time. Nina's head whipped to the side and she squinted into the gray-white void. There, standing by the edge of the playground, was a figure. It was small, like a child, and it was wearing a dress, one of those old-fashioned, lacy dresses that little girls wore a century ago. The child's hair was long and tangled, hanging in damp strands that stuck to its pale face. Nina's breath caught in her throat. The girl just stood there, motionless, head tilted slightly to the side. But there was something so off, so deeply wrong about the way she stood, so still, as if frozen in place. Nina wanted to call out, to ask if the girl was lost, but the words died in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to stay quiet. The girl took a step forward, her bare feet silent on the wet pavement. Then another step and another, moving slowly, deliberately, until she was just on the edge of the light from the bus stop. That's when Nina saw the girl's eyes, or rather, the empty, hollow sockets where her eyes should have been. The girl's face twisted into an awful too-wide grin, teeth too sharp, too many. Nina's scream was muffled by the fog, swallowed up by the mist. She stumbled backward, hitting the bench in the shelter, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The little girl giggled, a sound so unnatural that it made Nina's skin crawl, and the figure took another step closer. But then, headlights pierced through the fog. The bus emerged like a savior from a nightmare, its brakes screeching to a halt in front of the shelter. The doors hissed open, and Nina didn't think twice. She threw herself onto the bus, nearly tripping over the steps in her desperation. The driver, a grizzled old man with a look of concern, turned to her. "Whoa there, you all right, miss?" he asked. Nina was too out of breath to answer. She turned to look out the window, expecting to see the little girl, expecting her to be standing there, grinning with those empty eye sockets. But there was nothing. Only the playground, the fog, and the creaking swing. The bus pulled away, and Nina sank into her seat, hands still trembling. She told herself it had to have been a trick of the mist, her tired mind playing games. But deep down, she knew better. As the bus drove through the fog, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following, just out of sight, whispering and giggling in the dark. The night was heavy with silence, pressing in like an unwanted embrace, and the air tasted metallic, like the edge of a storm. Sam leaned against the rusty metal pole of the old, isolated bus stop on the outskirts of town. The shelter was decrepit, covered in graffiti and years of grime, with a flickering light overhead that threatened to go out at any moment. The road stretched into darkness in both directions, swallowed by the woods that bordered it. He checked his watch again, irritated. Midnight had come and gone, and the bus was nowhere to be seen. He didn't know if it had been delayed or if he'd missed it entirely. Either way, the idea of waiting here much longer made him uneasy. Something about the darkness tonight felt unnatural, too deep, too alive. The wind shifted, rustling through the trees, and Sam shivered. It wasn't just the cold. It was the feeling that the shadows were watching him, that unseen eyes peered at him from the thick woods. He tried to distract himself by looking at his phone, but he had no signal, and his battery was draining rapidly. Then he heard it. A soft crunch of gravel, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Sam's head snapped up, and he scanned the empty road. Nothing. The darkness stared back at him, unbroken. He tried to convince himself that it was just an animal or his imagination playing tricks. But then he heard it again, louder this time, the rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on the ground. "Hello?" Sam called, his voice shaking slightly. No response. The footsteps stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Sam took a step back, his pulse quickening. He couldn't see anyone, but he felt something. The prickling sensation along the back of his neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. He peered into the darkness, squinting, but the flickering light above him made it hard to focus. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. He was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long, stretching awkwardly as if the joints were put together wrong. He wore a long, dark coat, and his head was tilted at an uncomfortable angle, like a broken doll. His face was obscured by the brim of an old-fashioned hat, but the shadows seemed to cling to him, swirling around his feet. Sam's mouth went dry. "Hey man, you need something?" he managed to ask, trying to sound brave. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, and Sam noticed that his feet didn't make a sound this time. The earlier crunch of boots on gravel had ceased. The man's presence was unnervingly quiet now, almost as if he weren't really there. Sam's gut screamed at him to leave. But his legs felt like lead, and he could only watch in growing horror as the man tilted his head further. The brim of the hat lifted just enough for Sam to catch a glimpse of his face, or what was left of it. Where the man's eyes should have been, there were only deep, empty sockets, oozing a thick black liquid that dripped slowly down his gaunt cheeks. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged, broken teeth, and his skin was as pale and cracked as old porcelain. Sam stumbled back, almost losing his footing. The thing grinned wider, and a low, rumbling laugh bubbled from its throat. It was a noise that sounded like gravel scraping against metal, a terrible, inhuman sound. "No," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. His body finally obeyed, and he turned to run. But as soon as he spun around, his heart stopped. There was another figure standing in the road, waiting for him. This one was smaller, hunched over, with a face that was horribly burned, the flesh melted and fused into a mask of agony. It reached out with a bony hand, fingers twisted like claws. Sam screamed, and without thinking, he bolted to the side, sprinting into the woods. Branches whipped at his face, and he tripped over roots. But he didn't stop. The laughter followed him, echoing between the trees, and he could hear the crunch of something heavy moving through the underbrush behind him. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs ached and threatened to give out. But when he stumbled to a stop, gasping for air, he realized with a cold dread that the woods had grown silent again. The laughter had stopped. The shadows seemed to deepen, pressing in around him, and he felt utterly alone. Or so he thought. A whisper broke the silence, so close it felt like it was being breathed directly into his ear. "You can't hide." Sam's entire body went rigid, and he turned slowly, heart hammering. The tall man was there, standing impossibly close, those empty sockets staring into his soul, that smile twisting even wider. Sam's vision darkened, his mind unable to comprehend the horror. The last thing he remembered was the feel of those long, cold fingers wrapping around his throat, and the sound of that broken, inhuman laughter echoing through the woods. When the morning sun broke through the fog, the bus driver on his early route noticed something odd as he drove past the bus stop. Sam's backpack lay abandoned in the dirt, and the light above the shelter had finally gone out. But there was no sign of Sam, only deep, heavy footprints in the gravel leading into the woods, and the whispers of the wind that seemed to laugh as it carried secrets only the darkness knew. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the street was swallowed in a deep, impenetrable darkness. The only light came from a dim, buzzing street lamp beside the empty bus stop. Ethan was sitting on the cold metal bench, his breath fogging up the air, waiting for the last bus to take him home. It had been a long day, and his exhaustion was making him jittery. But there was something else, something about the night itself that felt wrong. He tried to distract himself, scrolling through his phone, but the service was spotty. The signal bars flickered, and then his phone lost all reception, leaving him more isolated than ever. He sighed, shoving the device back into his pocket and glancing around. The street was empty, lined with silent houses and shadowed alleys. The wind carried a chill that bit through his jacket, rustling the bare branches of the nearby trees. Ethan checked his watch. The bus was late. Again. He tapped his foot impatiently and listened to the distant hum of the city. But soon he noticed something strange. A sound that was soft at first, but grew steadily louder. It was a rhythmic tapping, echoing down the street like footsteps. Ethan's heart thumped in his chest. He peered down the road, but he couldn't see anyone. The tapping continued, coming closer, a deliberate, heavy beat against the pavement. It sounded wrong, uneven, as if whoever was walking was dragging something behind them. He stood up, his nerves on edge. "Hello?" he called into the night, his voice cracking. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was still. Ethan held his breath, straining to listen, his ears ringing with the sudden silence. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman. At least, it appeared to be. She was dressed in an old, tattered black dress, her movements unnaturally slow and jerky. Her head was bent forward, her long, matted hair hanging over her face. One of her arms was twisted behind her, holding something heavy. As she stepped into the dim glow of the street lamp, Ethan realized she was dragging an ancient-looking suitcase. It scraped and thumped against the ground with each step, leaving a dark, oily stain on the pavement. "Miss?" Ethan called out, swallowing the fear rising in his throat. "Are you lost?" The woman didn't answer. She stopped directly under the light, her head still bowed, her hair hiding her face. The street lamp flickered, casting shadows that seemed to shiver and crawl. Ethan felt rooted to the spot, dread spreading through his veins like ice. The suitcase she was dragging made a sudden noise, like something heavy shifting inside. A muffled thump. Ethan's stomach churned. The woman's head slowly tilted upward, and her hair parted just enough for him to see her face, or what was left of it. Her skin was gray and cracked, with patches that looked almost rotten. Her eyes were wide and sunken, the pupils nearly invisible, just tiny, pale orbs that stared into nothing. Her mouth was twisted into a crooked, nightmarish smile, stretching far too wide, showing yellowed teeth stained dark. Ethan stumbled back, his legs like jelly, but he couldn't look away. The woman's mouth opened, and a hoarse, rasping whisper slipped out. "It's heavy," she said, her voice like dried leaves rustling in the wind. She tilted the suitcase slightly, and something wet and dark leaked out of the corner. Ethan's terror finally broke through his paralysis. He turned and ran, sprinting down the street without looking back. He didn't care where he was going, only that he had to get away from whatever nightmare had just stepped out of the darkness. But as he ran, the tapping started again. It was louder now, following him, the suitcase dragging along, scraping and thumping in rhythm with his racing heart. Ethan didn't dare slow down, even though his lungs burned and his muscles ached. The sound was relentless, drawing closer, that horrible, uneven tapping echoing in his ears. He skidded to a halt when he saw headlights coming up the road. The bus. Relief washed over him, and he waved frantically, almost collapsing in front of the vehicle as it pulled up. The doors opened, and the driver, an older man with a concerned frown, gestured for him to get on. Ethan stumbled aboard, gasping for breath. "Go! Please! Just go!" he shouted. The driver hesitated for a moment, looking at Ethan with a mix of confusion and worry. But when he saw the panic on Ethan's face, he nodded and closed the doors. The bus started moving, pulling away from the darkness and back toward the city lights. Ethan collapsed into a seat, his whole body trembling. He looked out the window, expecting to see the woman standing there under the street lamp, but there was nothing, only the empty bus stop and the quiet night. He let out a shaky laugh, half mad with relief. Maybe it had been his imagination, a trick of exhaustion and fear. But as the bus drove on, Ethan couldn't shake the image of that woman's smile, nor the memory of the wet stain the suitcase had left behind. And somewhere, back in the darkness, the tapping continued. The rain had just begun, a soft patter on the old asphalt as Liam approached the lonely bus stop on the edge of town. The air was thick with mist, clinging to the ground and curling around his legs like something alive. The street lamp above the bus shelter flickered with a sickly yellow light, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Liam was drenched, his hoodie doing little to keep him warm, and he shivered, hugging himself as he checked the time on his phone. The bus was late, of course. It always seemed to be when the night was at its darkest, when he wanted to be anywhere but here. The road was deserted, the houses lining the streets silent and dark as if abandoned. He was completely alone, or so he thought. A rustling sound caught his attention, coming from the overgrown bushes just beyond the bus stop. Liam froze, straining to hear. The rain made it difficult to pick up on other noises, but there it was again, a low, whispery rustle like dry leaves brushing against each other. "Hello?" he called out, trying to sound brave. His voice echoed in the empty street, swallowed up by the mist. For a moment, there was no response. Then something shifted. A shape, barely visible, emerged from the fog. At first, it was just a silhouette, hunched and thin, dragging its feet across the wet pavement. As it came closer, Liam felt his stomach drop. The figure was a man, or what was left of one. His clothes were tattered and hanging off his skeletal frame, and his skin was a mottled, waxy gray, almost translucent in the weak light. His head was bowed, his face obscured by a mop of tangled, wet hair. His hands dangled at his sides, fingers twitching and curling as if they had a mind of their own. Liam's instincts screamed at him to run, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what he was seeing. The man shuffled closer, and a wet, wheezing sound came from his chest like a breath trying to escape lungs that no longer worked. Finally, he stopped a few feet away from Liam, his head still bowed. "Are you okay?" Liam managed to ask, his voice barely more than a whisper. The man's head snapped upward, and Liam stumbled back, nearly slipping on the slick ground. The face that looked up at him was grotesque. The flesh warped and stretched as though it had been melted. The eyes were hollow, empty sockets, leaking a black tar-like substance that dripped down his cheeks. His mouth twisted into a painful grimace, a parody of a smile. "Cold!" The thing croaked, the word gurgling in its throat. So cold. Liam couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing, took a step forward, and Liam noticed that its feet left dark, oily prints on the pavement, the substance spreading like a stain. It raised one trembling hand, reaching for him, and the smell hit him then. Damp earth, decay, and something chemical, something burned. A loud screech pierced the night, making Liam jump. Headlights appeared, cutting through the fog as the bus finally pulled up. The creature turned its head toward the bus, and for a moment its grimace faltered, replaced by something that almost looked like sorrow. It lowered its hand, and its body began to tremble, twitching uncontrollably. The bus doors swung open, and Liam didn't think twice. He bolted, leaping onto the bus and slamming into a seat near the front. The driver, an older woman with tired eyes, glanced back at him. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice gruff but concerned. Liam nodded, unable to speak, his heart pounding. He looked out the window, expecting to see the creature standing there, watching him. But there was nothing. Only the rain and the mist, the street lamp flickering and buzzing. The bus pulled away and Liam tried to calm down, telling himself it had been some awful hallucination, a trick of the fog and his tired mind. But as the bus rolled down the wet road, he noticed something smeared across the windows. Dark, oily handprints, like something had tried to claw its way inside. The midnight fog had rolled in thick and heavy, blanketing the quiet suburban streets as Jake stood under the flickering fluorescent light of the deserted bus stop. He rubbed his arms, feeling a chill that seeped deep into his bones, though the cold wasn't the only reason for his unease. The whole neighborhood felt different tonight, as though something was hiding behind the veil of fog, watching. The bus was late, and he cursed under his breath, checking his watch for the third time. The only sounds were the distant hum of the city and the occasional rustle of leaves. Even the stray cats that usually wandered this area were nowhere to be seen, as if they knew something he didn't. He adjusted his backpack and glanced around, trying to peer through the fog. The light from the street lamp barely illuminated the bus stop, and beyond that, everything was shrouded in an oppressive gray mist. But then Jake noticed a strange shape in the fog, just down the road. It was tall and thin, standing completely still. At first, he thought it might be a lamppost or a trick of the fog, but there was something distinctly human about its outline. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering slightly. The figure didn't move or respond. Jake's pulse quickened, and he took a cautious step forward, trying to get a better look. But the moment he moved, the shape melted back into the fog, vanishing so quickly it made him wonder if he'd imagined it. Jake took a shaky breath and laughed nervously to himself. Get it together, he thought. It's just the fog playing tricks. He backed up, resuming his spot under the light, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at him, prickling along his skin. Suddenly, the light above him went out with a loud pop, plunging the bus stop into darkness. Jake's heart leapt into his throat. He fumbled for his phone, the small blue glow of the screen barely cutting through the gloom. The shadows seemed to close in around him, and that's when he heard it. A low, scraping sound, like something being dragged across concrete. He spun around, holding his phone up like a shield, and his breath caught. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the fog, burning bright and yellow, staring directly at him. They were far too high off the ground, as though the creature they belonged to was towering over him. The scraping sound grew louder, and Jake's knees buckled as a figure emerged from the mist. It was impossibly tall, with limbs that looked wrong, too long, too thin, like crooked branches. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its mouth split into a jagged grin that stretched far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Jake backed up until he hit the bench, his legs refusing to carry him any farther. "Stay back!" he shouted, though his voice cracked in fear. The creature tilted its head further, and the scraping noise stopped. It was only then that Jake realized the sound was coming from the creature's hands, long, clawed fingers that dragged along the pavement. The grin never left its face as it took another step forward. Its voice, when it spoke, was a whisper, a soft, echoing hiss that made Jake's blood run cold. "You called for me," it said, as though amused. "I heard you." Jake's mind screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, trapped in the gaze of those unblinking yellow eyes. The creature's mouth twisted, and it leaned closer, its breath like the stench of decay. The world seemed to warp around him, the fog thickening, closing in. Then headlights pierced through the darkness, and the shriek of bus brakes shattered the suffocating silence. The bus pulled up to the stop, its doors hissing open, and the creature recoiled, its eyes narrowing. Jake didn't hesitate. He bolted onto the bus, nearly collapsing into a seat. The driver gave him a puzzled look. "You all right, kid?" he asked, but Jake couldn't answer. He looked out the window, heart pounding, expecting to see the creature waiting for him in the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist and the quiet street. Yet, as the bus pulled away, Jake noticed something etched into the glass of the shelter. Long, claw-like scratches, deep and fresh, as if something had tried to claw its way in. The bus rattled on, and Jake sat stiffly, clutching his backpack. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and he jumped, fumbling to pull it out. A new notification flashed on the screen, a message from an unknown number. "You called for me," it read. "I'll find you again." Jake stared at the message, the words blurring as his vision swam with fear. He could still feel those yellow eyes watching, still hear the scraping of claws echoing in his mind. And he knew, deep down, that whatever had come for him wasn't done yet.